Precious Lord, take my hand and lead me on, and let me stand. I am tired, I am weak, I want through the storm, through the night. Lead me on to the light. Take my hand, precious Lord, and lead me on.
Hello, my name is Dr. Howard Robinson, the National Center for the Study of Civil Rights and African American Culture at Alabama State University welcomes you to this virtual program honoring, memorializing, and examining the life and contributions of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in a tribute to what would have been his 93rd birthday. The theme of today's program is Martin Luther King Jr., Nonviolent Resistance to Racial and Social Injustice and its 21st Century Relevancy. This iconic African-American leader was born in Atlanta, Georgia on January 15th, 1929, and was assassinated on April 4th, 1968. During his 39 years, Reverend King emerged to become the voice of African-American aspirations for full citizenship. At 26 years old, King arrived in Montgomery, Alabama, to pastor the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, located only a few blocks from the Alabama State University campus. From 1954 to 1960, King occupied the pulpit of the church now known as the Dexter Avenue King Memorial Baptist Church. It was from Montgomery that King began to realize his destiny as a national, in fact, a world leader. King's role as a civil rights activist came into clearer view on December 1st, 1955, following the arrest of 42-year-old seamstress and NAACP Secretary Rosa Parks. Jailed for refusing to surrender her bus to a white man, the arrest prompted the call for a boycott of the city's racially segregated buses, a protest that would last some 362 days. King had only been in Montgomery for 3 months before he was selected to lead the organization created to oversee the bus protests, the Montgomery Improvement Association, or more commonly known as the MIA. As president of the MIA, King articulated a strategy of nonviolent resistance to the racial and social injustice endured for decades by Black people. He prompted civil disobedience as a way to overcome racial and social discrimination and to challenge unfair laws and practices. He persuaded Black Montgomery to show love for one's opponent rather than hate, to extend forgiveness rather than retaliation, believing that approach would bring about authentic and meaningful change and would usher in what King called the beloved community. The result was an emphasis on moral precepts coupled with the deliberate disobedience of racially unjust laws and policies. Today's program will highlight King's advocacy of nonviolent resistance as a philosophy based in theology and as a strategy steeped in history. Equally important, this program will consider how a generation is employing nonviolent resistance to change and challenge racial inequities in today's America. I would like now to introduce our speaker for today's program. Dr. Robert O. White II is an educator, a legal analyst, a pastor, and has taught in higher education for over 25 years. Dr. White has served in leadership capacities with the AFL-CIO, worked as in-house legal counsel for the Alabama Education Association, and is currently the president of the Alabama State University's Education Association. Dr. White has been the interim director of voter registration and elections for Alabama's Secretary of State office, and he has been a member of the Alabama State University faculty for over 20 years. Dr. White has produced several radio talk shows, published 3 books, and is working on several other projects dealing with civil rights and spirituality. He is the co-founder of the first registered African-American alternative energy program or company in the state of Alabama, Qual Energy. Currently, White, along with his wife, Nichelle, are pastoring the Montgomery City of Refuge and the Greenville City of Refuge, where he is committed to raising the spiritual and social consciousness of today's young people. Our guest speaker, Dr. White.
Good morning. My name is Robert White, and I am your speaker for this morning, and I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about someone who has infected the lives of so many people. And I'm just elated, and I want to thank the university and thank the center for allowing me to present to you. I want to welcome my students who will be chiming in, and friends and family, and hopefully we can have a meaningful, brief discussion about the contributions that Martin Luther King has made to the areas of civil disobedience and nonviolent resistance. But before we get started, I want to read a quote from Hannah Arendt in her book, Crisis of the Republic. She says, "Disobedience to the law, civil and criminal, has become a mass phenomenon in recent years, not only in America, but also in a great many other parts of the world. The defiance of established authority, religious and secular, social and political, as a worldwide phenomenon may well one day be accounted the outstanding event of the last decade." And she wrote those words in 1969, which means that after Martin Luther King's life, after his contributions, the world saw a tremendous rise in the amount of civil disobedience and nonviolent and violent resistance, which means that Martin Luther King, his efforts and the efforts of those who fought so valiantly to hold on to the Republic, those efforts resounded around the world. So when we look at Montgomery, when we look at Selma, when we look at the events that took place in the civil rights movement, we're not just looking at local issues and events, but we're looking at the growth of local events to national and international responses. And so in a republic, the standard for human behavior is an objective standard. It's a reasonable standard. And the behaviors of individuals who live in a republic are evaluated by how their actions correspond to logic. However, in a barbaric nation of tribalism and mob rule, the law of the land is do as thou wilt, to whom thou wilt, if thou art able. And its orthodoxy is a natural law of the survival of the fittest. Martin Luther King and others sought very valiantly to pull America out of its status quo of violence, of genocide, and of oppression into a direction that made for an even more perfect union. Yet this republic was created not for the monarchical or feudal systems of Europe, but it was a more advanced idea, recognizing that one man had no claim to another man's happiness, fortune, nor did he or she have a mortgage on another man's future. If this republic is to work, the highest standard of morality would be the rights of those individuals and the relationships that individuals would have with other individuals, without coercion or without force from a government or faction. If our nation has failed and our republic is lost, it is not because of foreign invaders or foreign ideas. For King feared that he was integrating his people into what he called a burning house. But it is because of those things that are taking place on the inside of America. It is because of the implosion of the ideas that America stands for, not from foreigners, but from the inside, that poses our greatest threat. It is because those at its inception chose not to eradicate the slave trade. It is because their prodigy chose, although it was stated that things should be integrated with all deliberate speed. It was from those who abandoned the principles of the Republic, abandoned the principles of freedom and personal liberties, in substitute for the familiarity of tyranny and mob rule. Those are the ones that are to blame. And those are the ones to whom we march against. Those are the ones to whom we boycott and protest. And it is those to whom receive the call of a higher calling. The January 6th takeover of Congress, the attempt to overthrow elections, the use of propaganda as a state-endorsed function, and sadly, the denial or the banning of more critical theories of race, and the threat to jail teachers for teaching certain subjects shows us that our republic is in serious trouble. Those things and others are not the marks of a republic, but those things are the marks of a socialist dictatorship. When Martin Luther King inspired others to march, to protest, to boycott, there were no tear gas on their parts. There were no lies told. There were no conspiracies. There were no hangman's nooses displayed. There were no guillotines dragged to Capitol Hill. Instead, we had the voice of truth. We had the gospel. We had the songs. We had the words of righteousness to offer to a nation that had long since violated its own principles. So we asked the question that Socrates asked: is it better to break the law, or is it better to be a victim of bad law? And so that leads me to the next part, to where we began by saying some have erroneously stated that the civil rights movement ended when the Voting Rights Act was passed, or when Martin Luther King was unfortunately killed. However, in reality, from the efforts of the 50s and 60s came an emerging politic, especially in Alabama, that marked the continuance of the movement in the form of what we call political action. So the nonviolent resistance of Martin Luther King, the civil disobedience that took place as a technique and a tactic for being recognized by the law, it did have a continuation, and it did have fruit that bore itself. But what if we haven't recognized just the critical aspect of that advancement? What if it has been minimized? What if it's been desensitized? What if it has been shrugged under the rug? Or what if it has been misdirected in other areas? Then it is highly possible that we may have accomplished more than we thought, which also means that we might have a greater responsibility to those enduring truths that we establish than we might think. In reality, from the efforts of the 50s and 60s came an emerging politic, especially in Alabama, marked by the birth of political action. The problem with our limited vision is that we are guilty of violating our Africanness or our indigenousness by putting individuals above people and separating the contributions of individuals from the overall objectives of the group. We are remiss if we only honor individuals without honoring the organizations from which they emerged and founded. If we look at things collectively, we might have accomplished far more than we have been given credit for, and may have neglected far greater a gift than we might assume. the Women's Political Council, the Union of Sleeping Car Porters, the Montgomery Improvement Association, the Tuskegee Advancement League, previously the Alabama State Teachers Association, the Dallas County Voters League, the Lowndes County Freedom Organization, the Mississippi Freedom Party, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and others gave birth to a new political force in Alabama that even to this day is hard to reckon with. The civil rights movement was, of course, political, as a means of self-determination was marked by the birth of political organizations like the Alabama Democratic Conference, known as the ADC. The ADC established chapters in each county of the state and fought to get not only Blacks delegates seated at the national convention, but got Blacks elected to almost every position in local and state government, including dog catcher, butterfly collector, sheriff, county commissioner, city council, mayor, state legislator, state school board, and also seats of power at local and state colleges, the creation of a congressional district, the election of 2 Blacks to the state Supreme Court, Justices England and Cook, the expansion of the federal courts, and the various consent decrees that were handed down by the courts. This is the legacy of the nonviolent and civil disobedient movement that Martin Luther King and others were able to enact. And so we must look at these things and recognize these things not as being fleeting, but as being a serious continuation. Also, the state also saw the rise of the most powerful political organization in Alabama history, the Alabama Education Association. The emerging of the Alabama Democratic Conference and then the New South Coalition was a direct offspring of the previous civil rights efforts of the 50s and 60s, and it is in the realm of political action that today's nonviolent and civil disobedience plays itself out. So we have to understand that there is a transition that naturally takes place in the political evolution of a people. A revolution may begin violently and then turn into civil and nonviolent resistance as the efforts begin to grow. But at some point, a sign of maturity, which will also lead to a sign of a much greater responsibility on the part of others, is that of political action. So now I want to briefly talk a little bit about the transition from King's efforts in nonviolence and civil disobedience to the role that those things play in the establishment of political action. Political action is the use of resources, typically money, to impact the outcome of an election or the passage or failure of legislation. And even today's nonviolent or civil disobedient measures should be aimed at the same. The efforts of Martin Luther King and others built for us a template for evaluating nonviolent and civil disobedient models. So when it is time for us to look and gauge the effectiveness of today's so-called nonviolent organization, today's so-called civil disobedient espousing organizations, today's so-called social and equal justice organizations, we must evaluate them from the marks, the benchmarks that have already been set. And a major problem that we have is that we lack the curriculum, we lack the classes, we lack the teachers, and we lack the opportunity to teach our history in such a way that a model of self-determination could emerge. We have to ask ourselves the question, even in the wake of George Floyd, even in the wake of Trayvon Martin, even in the wake of Michael Brown and others, and the organization or the mobilization rather that ensued, we have to ask ourselves the question, what bills have been passed or defeated? What lawsuits have been successful or failed due to the recent nonviolent resistance? What policies have been changed, added, or erased, and more effectively? And ladies and gentlemen, this is so important. Who has lost or gained office because of the civil disobedient actions that have taken place? Because Alexander Hamilton and the founding fathers wrote in the Federalist Papers that the only solution for usurpation and tyranny at the state level was a change of men. So if people are not losing their elected positions because of the civil disobedience, then the science that maintains tyranny at the local level is unfazed. And so we have to understand that until politicians begin to lose their job, or the response to the cries of the people become more salient and more fluid, then that person might be able to maintain their office without heeding to the cries of the people. That's what civil disobedience is supposed to do. Civil disobedience is a response to bad law. Civil disobedience in some way must be aimed toward a lawsuit at the federal level. Civil disobedience at some point must have as an objective the change of men, which means new elected officials to do what the previous organization or the previous regime could not do. It is the movement over, or are we just ignorant, unwilling, and miseducated or unable to build from the momentum of the past? Because the means of self-determination necessary for the advancement of Black people and all people have been intentionally mystified, remain untaught or neglected, are misinterpreted or redirected to hide from Black people the true nature of their condition, so that the proper means of advancement cannot take place. We cannot help but wonder if people who have allegedly aligned themselves to the cause of African Americans have done so purely to take advantage of the rich culture and the momentum that was posed by people like Dr. Martin Luther King, who risked life and limb for the betterment not only of their people, but for all people. And it is often stated that Martin Luther King received his influence, and even Martin Luther King acknowledged Thoreau, acknowledged Gandhi. But what is true is that Martin Luther King was as influenced by Kwame Nkrumah, was as or more influenced by Sekou Touré, was more influenced by Kwame Touré, formerly known as Stokely Carmichael, and by his mentor here at Alabama State, Dr. Lawrence Reddick, in the advancing of the struggle against oppression, which was global, because no one can compare the sufferings of Thoreau and Gandhi to the sufferings of King and to the sufferings of others. Whereas Martin Luther King sought to liberate all humanity from the oppression that was being posed by colonial forces. As opposed to focusing on the things that King said that united people, which can easily be construed to open the door for agendas that dilute the Black agenda, we must look at the same King and look at the words that he said that make for divergence or separation from other people who have surely been the benefactor of Black advancement. Black people continue in most instances to go to jail quicker, to get laid off faster, to die more frequently in emergency rooms or under doctor's care, to flunk out of school faster, to get disciplinary write-ups faster, to miscarry their pregnancies more frequent, to get shot by police quicker, to contract cancer faster, to go into bankruptcy in much more frequency than others, or to get cast or scripted for roles in movies to where they are enemies of their own people and unrecognizable to them as well. Ours is a peculiar situation. And we have to understand that history plays a mighty role in the successful efforts of Martin Luther King and others in the push for civil rights and civil disobedient resistance to oppression. W.E.B. Du Bois asked a prophetic question over a century ago. What if some 100 years hence, the only Negro to survive is the Negro that white people have created in the plays and short stories and novels that they have written? James Weldon Johnson said, and the mentor of Martin Luther King, while at ASU, Dr. Lawrence Reddick reiterated the fact that a people may become great by many means, but the only way that that greatness is recognized is by the amount and standard of art and literature they have produced. No great people have not produced great art and great literature. So while other people have written books and have analyzed the efforts of Martin Luther King and others, the philosophy of Martin Luther King, the thoughts of Martin Luther King for their own advancement, it could be argued that African Americans themselves have not studied enough, have not put in the necessary time to study the celebrated accomplishments of the past, so which that we can continue to advance as a people of our republic. It is not until African Americans by themselves and for themselves do deep dives into their own history and stop allowing other people to define for them who they should honor and why, that true models of self-determination can emerge and the people can advance. This begins by Black people taking hold of their own narratives and building political models from those realities. Now, on to a next point, and that is the struggle that Martin Luther King went through himself in the road from what we call being a good man to a good citizen. Hannah Arendt and also others acknowledged in the world of civil disobedience that was emerging in the post-King era. They acknowledged that there were some similarities within the social movements there that were acknowledged by the ancient Greeks. And the ancient Greeks acknowledged good men and good citizens. Martin Luther King quoted philosophers of the Western mind, which means that he was well-versed in the understanding of European Enlightenment. The struggle of the African American was not to be divorced from the struggle of humanity as a whole, which is a quest for meaning beyond what Camus called the absurdity of life. Someone said, if life is not worth examining, it is a life that's not worth living. And entering into the civil rights movement was not done without first counting the cost. Martin Luther King and others did not simply enter into the movement, nor was their entrance into the movement a knee-jerk reaction, or as Frantz Fanon says, a reflex, if you would, to a stimulus. It was calculated. And it took what the ancient Greeks called paideia. In order to enter into a movement and to see it through like a good citizen would, the person would have to go through long meditation and events of self-discovery, which is so important. And perhaps this world, as it is now, might not want that. It might not want a deep reflection of the past. It might not want us to do a deep soul searching based on the accomplishments of former years. But ladies and gentlemen, it is necessary that all of us search within ourselves the true origin and nature of the motives that generate us to do what we do. Sure, Martin Luther King was a good man. He was a good man being pastor of Dexter Avenue Baptist Church. He was a good man with his doctoral degree. But when it was time for him to stand up for those in Montgomery who were being disrespected on the buses, when it was time for him to stand up against the war in Vietnam, when it was time for him to stand up and applaud the liberation of African nations from their colonial masters, he ceased to be a good man. Because in the Greek societies, a good man was one whose interaction and perhaps interjection was temporary. And yes, a lot of people in the so-called civil rights movement had their entrances and their exits. They could pick and choose their involvement. And then when they thought it was over, they could go back and resume a life. But that's not the case for the good citizen. The good citizen just doesn't temporarily respond to a stimulus. The good citizen is not just one who holds a sign or marches from Selma to Montgomery, or one who has his fist in the air. But a good citizen is one who recognizes an enduring responsibility. A good citizen is constantly in a crisis because he or she is constantly evaluating self-interest versus the interest of the group. And while others seem to so easily throw off the relationship that they have with other people, the good citizen is evaluating every step he or she makes to make sure that that step does not infringe on the rights of his fellow man. That is an enduring responsibility. And the transition in King's life from being a good man to a good citizen recognized the fact that all of the accomplishments that King had experienced before the boycott could have very well been a hindrance to his advancement into a good citizen. He had to be willing to throw it all away. He had to be willing to sacrifice friendships, sacrifice family life, sacrifice the future of being a good pastor or being a good teacher or being a good anything, simply because the call for freedom is an enduring one. And the rights of people are constantly being treaded on by a government and by a people who don't recognize the existence of human dignity. So we must understand that the paideia that King did, the self-searching, the critical analysis of self, was so important to his enduring responsibility, even to the point to where he would pay for it with his life. Why didn't King fight back? Why didn't he call for violent revolution? Why didn't he stand back and watch America burn? Why didn't he do those things that other people in other nations would do? It is possibly because while he did not quote them much, he was following in the line and the legacy of literary African-American resistance. He was following perhaps in the line of Frederick Douglass, in the line of Harriet Jacobs, in the line of William Wells Brown, those to whom wrote valiantly not to expose their masters, not to, as the young people say, put them on blast, but they wanted the slave trade ended. And if they could end the slave trade while preserving the integrity of their oppressor, they saw no problem in doing that. That is a mark of the high republic. That is a mark of a true citizen of what this nation is all about, and not the fakery of those people who have occupied its hallowed halls for so long. Martin Luther King didn't want to hurt anyone, but he did want the change to come. And he and others used violence, used the violent environment as a means to try and shock the conscience of the nation. But we must understand where we are, ladies and gentlemen, because African Americans did not get their rights as a result of a national repudiation of the past, not even a repudiation of the slave trade, not even a repudiation of Jim Crow. It came about as a result of a shift in the legal theories of the U.S. Supreme Court. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, it seems as if our fate was left up to 9 men and the legal theories that they possessed, rather than the incessant cries, rather than the truths and calls for justice at the street level. Here again, all things rested in the Supreme Court. And we have to understand, and my constitutional law students would know, that for so many years we had state-supported terrorism. And it was against state-supported terrorism and what we call dual sovereignty that made for such a challenge to the civil rights workers. But at the same time, civil disobedience, as opposed to criminal disobedience, was the best way to address the very unusual position that Black people were in. They were stuck between a federal government who seemed to be unwilling and who seemed to be reluctant to intervene into the suffering of Blacks, and a state government that was instituting both violent and nonviolent means to keep African Americans in the position that they were in. This began with Colfax, Louisiana massacre and Cruikshank versus the United States, then Plessy versus Ferguson, and then a string of lawsuits began. The Fleming case in South Carolina, the Brown versus Board of Education case, and then Browder versus Gale, and Boynton versus Virginia. But you see the struggles of the application of the 14th Amendment to the sufferings of blacks at the state level. And so now civil disobedience becomes a means of addressing bad law. And what is bad law? Bad law are laws that were created arbitrarily or subjectively to target one particular group of people within a body politic that is to be indivisible, at least by superficial means. The First Amendment gives us the right to associate. It gives us the right to assemble. It gives us a right to free speech. It gives us a right to publish, and it gives us a right to a redress of grievances. But it does not give us the right, or should not give us the opportunity, to use those things to sponsor tyranny. So we have two groups emerging, of which civil disobedience took on: the violent mobs and the nonviolent means of resisting the advancement of civil rights. And I will say this, ladies and gentlemen, that the nonviolent means of white supremacy were far more effective, far more lasting, and far more effectual than the violent ones. And it is the nonviolent machinery and mechanics that were put into place that keep things divided and keep things askew and keep the races at each other's throats even now. We have not studied the nonviolent efforts of the White Citizens Council and those things that took place after the boycott was over to maintain and ensure that racism was not trending anymore and was diminishing by the decades. We've studied, we've at least mentioned and skimmed through the nonviolent efforts of Martin Luther King and the civil rights efforts. But we have not identified and have not nullified those nonviolent policies, those nonviolent means of keeping the masses of people in poverty, uneducated, and incarcerated. And it is those things that the social sciences are responsible for using. And Martin Luther King himself, in his nonviolent efforts, had one foot in the social sciences and one foot in the STEM environment, which made for a unity of academics. Martin Luther King spoke about the detriment to the environment as a result of the Vietnam War. And when Martin Luther King feared that he was integrating his people into a burning house, that symbolism may very well be used to identify global warming and the rise of what physical scientists call the Anthropocene. We may very well know that Martin Luther King was well aware of the nonviolent forms of segregation, such as the use of the laying of bridges and highways to decimate Black communities, the use of highway projects to destroy Black infrastructure, Black business zones, and to fluctuate the housing market to a point to favor the suburban lifestyle versus the urban lifestyle. Martin Luther King knew in his various writings and in Where Do We Go From Here, he understood that violent rhetoric not aimed at people, for as the apostle says, we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities and spirits and forces of darkness in high places. Martin Luther King understood that. Martin Luther King understood the stealth that private corporations were using to steer society in an even more divided direction. Martin Luther King did use violent rhetoric, but it was against the business practices in the inner city. It was against the corporations that were exploiting Black consumers. It was against corporations who weren't hiring Blacks in upper level positions. It was against the companies, the stores that would move into the Black community and charge them much higher. It was against systems that would, like Alabama, that would defund public transportation. Yes, before the bus boycott, before Browder versus Gale, before Uri Browder Susie McDonald, Mary Louise Smith, and Claudette Colvin, before they even took their stands, there was already efforts in place to end the bus system. And that was because Alabama was being lobbied heavily by the automobile industry to end public transportation in favor of private automobile sales. That, along with the rise of what we call suburbia, would not only choke urban areas and Black areas of economic growth and development, but it would also be the new means of segregation and the new means of oppression against African Americans. And Martin Luther King identified that. He identified mobility, or the lack thereof, as being the next aspect of our struggle. And not the fact that the opportunities were present, but the fact that a lot of African Americans could not make it to the side of town where those opportunities were present. There were efforts in Montgomery after the bus boycott, leading even up into the 80s and 90s, to regenerate the bus system. And the research done by many people here at Alabama State University were able to address those issues, but the damage had already been done. The food deserts had already been created. The economic impact zones had already been created. The Superfund zones had already been created. And so now we find ourselves rethinking and revisiting the vision that Martin Luther King had. Martin Luther King had an understanding and a clairvoyance of those hidden forces that were at work. He had an understanding that the conspiracy against African Americans was not only local, was not only a state function, but it also reached the heights of Washington, D.C. So the fight became a fight at Washington because Washington assumed the role as being the main arbitrator between the states and African Americans who were dependent so much on the resistance efforts that they and others were doing. They were dependent so much on the United States Congress obtaining and maintaining a conscience. And so we have to understand that Martin Luther King and the efforts that he posed served to be a major personality and milestone for the consciousness of America. The American system was created to be amended and corrected by a change of men and not law. So my question to you is, how could the law change and the people who are responsible for enacting the law remain in office? How is it that we could get the passage of a Voting Rights Act and a Civil Rights Act and the same oppressors, the same personalities whose words led the lynch mobs, whose words led the police-sanctioned brutalities, whose same words instigated lynchings and instigated the bombings of houses? How could those laws be done away with, yet the people who enacted those laws remain in power? It shows that there has been a lack of transition from civil disobedience and nonviolent resistance to political action. Because in other countries, civil disobedience and nonviolent resistance are done to effectuate regime changes, but not the law. In other countries, people will go into the streets, and yes, they will protest for days, sometimes weeks and months, but it is to remove a dictator. But in America, the dictators remained, and only the laws change. Are we prepared to do battle in those areas where we need to? Do we have the scholarship present to outline the means and the methods of challenging this un-American, ungodly, unconstitutional, savage, barbaric, and tribalistic culture that we're in now? Are we armed and equipped with the knowledge that is necessary for us to put even ourselves in positions of compromise or in positions to be sacrificed for the sake of the greater good? Civil disobedience is an act against bad law, but the election is an act against bad people. The best way to ensure that you're taking care of is to vote your oppressors out of office. The circumstances associated with the Montgomery bus boycott are a good example of the role disobedience plays in changing the law and making of social relationships that much more meaningful. Susan McDonald, in her testimony, as we've discovered in looking at the Browder versus Gale transcripts, she makes an awesome statement. In response to cross-examination by the defense counsel, she stated that she was not protesting and she did not take her stand on the bus, and I will quote her, for no social equality. She said they wanted to be recognized. And by filing a federal lawsuit, the assumption is they wanted to be recognized under the law. And those plaintiffs and the role that Fred Gray played in harnessing the critical thought of not just those four plaintiffs, but the masses of people that they represented was critical in the advancement later of Martin Luther King and others' efforts of nonviolent and civil disobedience. We must understand these things are looked at as being barbaric, primitive, illogical, and unreasonable. But in all actuality, civil disobedience and nonviolent resistance is the best way to reap change within a republic. A republic creates a world of equality whereby those of the polis or the body are bound by social contracts. So no one is to have a mortgage over others, and all should be free to exercise their God-given rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Can a law be enacted that is by nature against the consent of the people? Ours is a republic whose Udemic government gets power by the consent of the governed. However, as Martin Luther King stated so many times, what if the governed have not given their consent, or by bad law have been removed from the power to give their consent? An even more critical question, which is posed in ancient times that confronted the Black protesters: are those who have disfranchised or have been disfranchised justified in breaking the law when the law is unjust, or is it okay to become a criminal to change the law? Running away from one's master during slavery times was illegal. Any act of defiance to one's master during slavery was illegal. And even the slaves, as they wrote in the narratives, expressed a reluctance to be a criminal or a lawbreaker. That was because deep within their conscience, they knew that it was very dangerous to become a lawbreaker, even if the laws were unjust. Martin Luther King and others understood the ethical questions of even breaking the law when the law was aimed against them. They knew that they walked a fine line, because once you break the law, it's hard to come back. So they understood with paideia. They practiced the inner struggles. They asked the inner questions, the deep philosophical questions. They counted the cost. And I believe that they received and will receive their rewards, not only in this life, but in the next one. We are so thankful to have been able to address you today. And we hope we said some things that would at least inspire you to do more research. And I invite you, and I especially emphasize my students, whom I love so much, to do as much research as you can on the struggles of former years, because those struggles in and of themselves pose the best example of how to make decisions in the present. We honor Dr. Martin Luther King. We honor the organizations that emerged to carry on the task. And ladies and gentlemen, we cannot for 1 minute think that the man had a dream and not a plan. He had a plan, and it has manifested itself in various ways. But We cannot teach what we don't know. We have to begin to do deep dive history and emerge and re-emerge ourselves in the task of continuing the quest for truth. I'm finished. Thank you so much for having me. I want to thank the National Center, thank Alabama State University under the leadership of Quentin Ross, Dr. Quentin Ross. And I want to thank all of those who tuned in today. Let's keep the dream alive.
Our speaker has helped us to see Reverend Martin Luther King as a chief advocate for nonviolent resistance and direct action protest. He's also given us food for thought regarding how these concepts are being used to address persistent areas of discrimination faced by a new generation. I would be remiss if I did not clarify a misstatement I made in our introduction, claiming that the Montgomery bus boycott lasted for 362 days, and it actually lasted for 382 days. I think Dr. Dorothy Orchard was having a sort of a breakdown when I said that, so I wanted to rectify that. However, on the behalf of Dr. Janice Franklin, I'm the project director for the National Center for the Study of Civil Rights and African American Culture, and the entire National Center staff. I want to thank you for your participation. Goodbye.
When my